This is a presentation I gave in November 2019 with Hazard Co up in Auckland. First thing to say is some of the stuff you might feel is really unlikely to happen to you, but just use the example of this guy who was hit by lightning, caught on CCTV, and in fact not hit just once but hit twice by lightning. So whatever you may think, these unlikely events could happen, and if they do, they can be pretty expensive. What I'm going to cover for the next 20 minutes is some learnings from some WorkSafe prosecutions and examples from our industry. And then secondly, just talk briefly about how insurance can work for protecting you in a health and safety situation. Don't shoot the messenger. We didn't write the law, we don't prosecute cases, we're just providing you with some examples and then insurance that can protect you in cases where this might happen to you. So the first question is, do you ensure all your workers know to wear seatbelts? You might feel like that's a crazy thing that you need to be responsible for, but as you'll see in this next example, a company was sentenced after a vehicle fatality, and the judgment was handed down earlier this year. A worker was crushed and killed when the truck they were driving rolled down a bank. And the company in question, Crowfar Crouch, failed to communicate, monitor and enforce policies that vehicles can only be driven by workers that are wearing seatbelts and had appropriate licenses. So this is a situation where they had a policy, but they failed to communicate, monitor and enforce it. They were fined 350 grand and paid reparations to the dead man's family of $187,000. Second question, do you exercise care, diligence and skill to ensure that your business complies with its health and safety obligations? So this might apply to you if you're not on site or directly observing, participating in the health and safety decisions. Might be perhaps a wife involved in a company listed as a director, partners, other managers or officers that are not on site but operating, working out of an office. You all have health and safety obligations. So in this example, a painter suffered brain trauma after falling from mobile scaffold. This judgment was handed down just over a year ago, and the mobile scaffold was incorrectly installed. He was brought in as a contractor to complete work at the building company's premises, fell 2 meters onto a concrete floor and received some serious injuries. The building company had identified the fall as a potential risk, but had no system in place for a pre-work check to ensure the scaffold was properly installed and fit for purpose. So in this example, they had identified the risk, but hadn't done anything about it. They were fined $150,000 and had to pay reparations of $42,000. So the first case was a worker, the second case is a subcontractor. And here's an example of a dashboard where if you are not directly on site, not directly involved in health and safety, but as an officer or director of a company or senior manager, also have responsibility under the Act, the kind of thing that you might want to review on a monthly or quarterly basis to make sure that the company is complying with its obligations and that issues are being identified and addressed and managed. So, do you check how site access could affect pedestrian right-of-way? This is an example of someone, a member of the public that's been affected and the company prosecuted when an elderly man fell off his mobility scooter when he hit a damaged section of footpath. This happened back in March 2017. The company involved was fined $500,000 and that judgment was only just recently handed down. So it's taken 2.5 years for this judgment to work its way through the courts. And WorkSafe said their investigation found that Shannon Thompson concrete pumps failed to work with other companies on site to identify the damaged footpath as a risk. There was no site-specific risk assessment, and the company failed to identify and put in place controls to manage the risks related to entry and exit of heavy vehicles onto the site. So in the first example, they had a policy, they didn't enforce it. In the second example, they had identified the risk, but they hadn't done anything about it. And in this example, they hadn't even done the assessment. They didn't even bother. And in fact, these guys didn't even turn up to court and didn't participate in the process all the way through, hence the size of the fine. On another topic, do you get involved in demolition work? That could be whole house demolitions, commercial, clearing out of a premises for a refit, or work to do an alteration or addition on a domestic property. Here's a video of a house that was being demolished up in Auckland a couple of years ago. Won't play the video. You can jump on YouTube and see it. And the company was fined not for the fact that this wall collapsed. You can see at the back of the picture another digger bucket holding up that wall, while a second digger operator is demolishing the building. He hits the side of this wall, it falls over, hits the house adjacent to it, damages a gas mains, and so there's gas all over the place. And in fact, the woman in that house was in a wheelchair and was unable to exit the property as a result of this situation. The company were actually fined because they didn't do anything about asbestos in the building. So that incident was in December 2017, and in September 2019 a judgment was handed down where they were fined $150,000. The neighbour was trapped in the property, as I said, and workers were at risk of exposure to asbestos. A couple other examples at a glance from earlier this year. Phil Sterling Building and Duncan Engineering were both fined over $150,000 as joint PCBUs, where they both had responsibility, where some staff were installing purlins using a mobile scaffold. The purlins were left unbolted, but the companies didn't make the workers aware of that. So these purlins fell and struck some of the people working there. One suffered concussion, a mild brain injury, and has not returned to work. The other has suffered injuries but has returned to work. So reparations were awarded to those injured parties of $155,000 in addition to those fines. And in December of last year, Style Construction was fined $100,000 and reparations were awarded of $43,000 when a worker sustained traumatic brain injury and fractures to his skull and right arm, where he fell through an open void while working on a residential construction site. So you would think that with all the fall from height stuff this wouldn't happen, but it continues to. Now, enforceable undertakings is an alternative to WorkSafe prosecuting someone for a health and safety event. It's basically an agreement between WorkSafe and the duty holder, or the PCBU, and it's entered into voluntarily by the duty holder following a breach of health and safety law. Once it's in place, it's legally binding. Some key features: that must be requested by the duty holder, so WorkSafe won't offer it to you. It won't be accepted if the breach of your duties has been reckless, and there's some specific criteria around that. And the process of prosecution will continue until the undertaking has been accepted. So they'll continue to develop a case against you to take to court until this enforceable undertaking has been accepted. It's not an admission of guilt. You must address the failings that were identified. You must make amends to the victims, and then this process will allow you to avoid a prosecution, all the legal costs that go with it, and the reputational damage of that as well. Here's an example of one. Begovich Builders. It cost them $200,000 to make amends, to put in place the alternative measures and all the costs that went with this process. You can see the outcome took 2 years because this event was in October 2016. Workers were erecting timber frames on a new residential build. They had to walk the frames manually into place, and one of them fell backwards onto 2 of the workers, and 2 others were crushed beneath the frames. 3 of the workers sustained injuries, of which the most severe and life-changing was a burst vertebrae, resulting in paraplegia for the injured worker. Something you might not think about, but is increasingly relevant, not just in our industry, but across the board, is bullying and harassment. These are WorkSafe issues, and WorkSafe can prosecute. Studies suggest that between 1 in 5 and 1 in 3 New Zealanders are affected by bullying or harassment, and businesses have a duty to recognise it as a health risk and deal with it and have processes and procedures in place to sort it out. So in Australia, Luke Chenoweth was fined $21,000 for setting an apprentice on fire just earlier this year. Now, this guy had previously been tied to a ladder with duct tape, had his arms and face covered with silicone and permanent marker, and had been locked in a shipping container. The lawyer for the person who was fined said that at 26 years of age, he had fallen prey to an unhappy culture on the worksite. So that is a responsibility that the company also would bear, and you have to bear in mind that it's not acceptable to have that kind of culture or for those kind of events and issues to be happening, and needs to be addressed as part of your health and safety policies. So this brings me to insurance. What's available to help you manage or to help you in the event that you are prosecuted for a health and safety problem? So the policy that's available is called Statutory Liability Insurance. Covers health and safety among other things. Resource management breaches of the Fair Trading Act as well. First thing to say is that it's illegal to insure for the fine under health and safety legislation, so that's not insurable. But it will cover your legal costs and reparations that a judge may award in a case. So those can be pretty substantial costs as well, as you would have seen in the previous slides. Our policy has a limit of 1 million. That's pretty standard. You can have less and you can also request more, but 1 million is pretty standard. Now starts as $150 plus GST for a small firm, which would have 3 or less employees, and would increase from there. So very affordable given the cover that it gives you. You can get an instant quote through our website. That's part of our liability package. So you get public liability, then you can add on statutory liability. Now I mentioned bullying and harassment, and in addition to it being a health and safety issue and potentially prosecutable that way, you can also be taken to the Employment Relations Authority if an employee has an issue. And bullying and harassment could be one of those, but there are other issues as well. So I'm just going to cover that briefly. So earlier this year, a builder resigned following a heated argument with his boss. He was awarded more than $17,000 by the Employment Relations Authority. And bear in mind, this guy resigned. So despite resigning, the authority found that the employer breached employment law, including failure to keep holiday pay and leave records, to pay annual holiday leave, and failing to provide an employment agreement. So these penalties were put in place because of really a failure to follow process and to pay those costs. So what's employee disputes insurance? It provides protection from allegations of wrongful acts committed by you against an employee. It covers the cost of defending these actions and any damages awarded against the directors, management, or company. The average cost of a claim from one specialist insurer is $14,000. That's on average. Common areas of exposure include personal grievances, claims for unjustified dismissal, discrimination or harassment, unlawful, constructive or actual termination, emotional distress, failure or refusal to hire potential employees, and breach of privacy. Our policy has a $50,000 limit and starts at $80 plus GST. And again, depending on the size of your business, that would be more, and there are other limits available also. You can add this to your policy as part of a broader management liability package or just as a standalone policy. So in a nutshell, prosecutions by WorkSafe are increasing. They've got more money in this year's budget from the government to do that, to improve enforcement. Reparations are increasing because judges are now able to award uncapped reparations. Statutory liability insurance covers the legal costs and reparations of a prosecution but can't legally cover the fine. Employment disputes are on the rise, and the litigation around those and grievances taken to the Employment Relations Authority are on the rise. The average cost of one from one insurer is around $14,000. And if you have employee disputes insurance, it's very affordable and it will cover these costs. That's it from me. If you want to have a chat about liability for you as a tradie, then give us a call, 0800 284 584, or jump on our website, builtin.co.nz, where you can get instant quotes, read heaps of information about the different risks you face, the different policies that are available, the ins and outs. Yeah, cheers.